Welcome to another episode of Infographic Instant with Brian Michael. In this episode, we'll be looking at the question of whether local government growth complements or substitutes for central government development. Before talking about the infographic you see in front of you, we should back up and talk a little bit about the paper from which this infographic comes. That paper looks at the size and structure of government and assesses the extent to which government responds to changes in its organizational environment. So, for example, if the macroeconomy changes very quickly, to what extent does government respond to those changes? And does such a response happen before, which we call strategically, during, which we call contemporaneously, or after, which we call reactively? Now, naturally, if government is complementary, if central government and local government are engaged in complementary activities, then we would see the overall size of government grow while not necessarily observing radical changes in the structure. So think about a snowball. As the inner core gets bigger, the outer core gets bigger proportionately, and the whole size of the snowball increases, but you wouldn't necessarily see the shape of the snowball change. If central government and local government are substitutes, we might see that snowball shape change very radically. So again, to take our metaphor of the snowball, imagine that you have a large increase in central government, but a low increase in the growth of local government. Then, using our snowball metaphor, we might see an increase in the icy center of the snowball, while not necessarily observing an increase in the softer, snowy outer shell of the snowball, of course causing the shape of the snowball to change. So it's not just an academic question about whether central government and local government are complementary or substitutable. In fact, it strikes at the very core of our question as to what extent does government change with overall changes in the macroeconomy. Now, let's turn our attention to the infographic we see in front of us. On the horizontal axis, we see national involvement in certain policies, and on the y-axis, we see subnational expenditure. So we're not comparing two like variables directly, but we're hoping that both variables give us a sufficiently reasonable proxy for involvement of that level of government. We can basically divide this graph into four quadrants. In the lower left-hand quadrant shows low involvement of the central national government in certain policies and low levels of subnational government expenditure. So countries such as Belgium, Moldova, Hungary, and Russia are characterized by low overall government involvement. In the upper left-hand quadrant, we see countries like Finland and Denmark. These governments have traditionally been associated with a hands-on approach of government at all levels. On the right-hand upper side, we see high national involvement in certain policies and high levels of subnational government expenditure. And we might observe Czech Republic and Spain as some examples of these kinds of governments. And in the lower right-hand quadrant, we see high national involvement with low subnational involvement, as characterized by governments such as Bulgaria, Portugal, to a lesser extent Azerbaijan. So and the correlation in general between countries appears to be negative. If we read the graph basically from left to right, we see that as national involvement in certain policies increases, subnational expenditure tends to fall across countries. So what does this mean for our overall paper? This means in general that different countries have a different dynamic of government response. And this is roughly what the main conclusion of our paper is. Namely, we cannot generalize across all types of government. Instead, we have to group certain kinds of governments together. Now, before we leave our discussion of this infographic, we should note that these data come from Schrinkel in 2009, and you can see the full reference in the paper. So please do not necessarily assume that these data come uniquely from us, and the viewer should see that paper for more information. This has been another infographic instant with Brian Michael.